Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is John Robb. John is a returning guest. In fact, he's been on the show so many times, I can't even count how many. He's one of our go-to folks on military intelligence and strategic stuff. Those who want to follow John and learn more about his thinking, check him out on Patreon and Substack. I've been a subscriber to his Patreon since the damn thing was put up. And I got to say, it's well worth the $5 or whatever the hell it is I pay to him these days. So if you want to help John, want to learn more, go subscribe to him, Patreon or Substack. So welcome back, John.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me back.
Well, the reason I reached out to John this time, it's always something, is I got in my inbox a new essay that he wrote called What Went Wrong with America. Generally, I am pretty suspicious of single cause arguments, that X caused all this shit to happen. But I got to say, in this case, John makes a reasonably good argument. But before we get into the argument of how, why don't you recap, as you did in the essay, where we are? Why do you think that we need to address what went wrong before we talk about what went wrong?
Yeah, we're lurching from crisis to crisis, kind of a perma-crisis situation. And underneath that, if you dig a little bit, you'll see that we have suffered extreme amounts of damage to core pillars of our society. We've lost a lot of our cohesion. We've fragmented, politically polarized, become fractious, and that we've lost a lot of our coherence, our ability to make decisions, ability to identify what's a fact and what's not a fact, and agree on that. And that's in part driven by a loss of cohesion, right? Because when we get online and we see somebody say something, we immediately try to parse as whether or not they are in the enemy camp or not.
I'm going to give you an example. I've been meaning to write an essay on it, but I've been too lazy, about knee-jerk, stupid tribalism that even smart people fell into it at a staggeringly high rate. And that was when the assassination attempt on Trump occurred. Well, I have friends on both sides, even out into the extremes pretty far. I got foamers on the left, foamers on the right, and everything in between. And anybody from, about, the 25th percentile to the left or the 25th percentile to the right, both hopped to two different, obviously wrong theories about the Trump assassination. On the left, they were saying, it's staged, right? This has to have been a staged event by the Trump campaign to get sympathy for Trump. And then on the right, it was, this is the deep state, right? I think Jordan Hall, our friend, mutual friend, ran a poll on Twitter, and something like 40% of the people that follow him, which leans to the right these days, said, it's the deep state, when the obvious answer was lone nut. And how do we know this? And because when you want to say, of course you don't know, but how do you reduce the probabilities of either deep state or staged to very low? We had one fact at the time, and that one fact was all we actually needed, was he was shot in the ear. Nobody would shoot somebody in the ear from 150 yards as a staged event. Even the shooting instructor for the Navy SEALs wouldn't guarantee that he wouldn't fuck up that shot, right?
Right.
And then the second data point was, it obviously wasn't the deep state because he's not dead, right? If it was the Navy SEALs shooting instructor, or the Marine Corps sniper instructor, it would have been a center of body mass with a 300 Win Mag, and he'd been a dead motherfucker, right? So the only data point that we knew almost instantly essentially ruled out both of those theories, yet quite smart people on both sides leapt to that, and many of them stayed stuck on that absurd tribal lens view for weeks.
And they stayed stuck on that view. That's the key. Even after more evidence appeared and we processed it, we talked about it, they still wouldn't relent on that perspective. Yeah, so it makes our ability to think through problems collectively as a society pretty hard. if you can't trust your senses, which are basically all of us collecting information and perception, how can you make decisions? It's like, can't trust your eyes and ears, you lose your ability to decide what's right, what's wrong, what's here, what's there.
Yeah, I would go one step further and say that, and I've been warning about this for years. People always ask me, well, what are your theories on social collapse? And I enumerate, climate change, comets, EMPs, blah, blah, blah. Here's one I would put the biggest stack of chips on, is a comprehensive breakdown in our collective sense making. This data point was the highest watermark I've seen so far that shows that we are down the road fair far where a event that has a factual anchor that rules out most of the crazy shit, nonetheless, something like at least 25% or maybe more, it could have been 30% of the populace quickly gets anchored on the crazy shit and can't get off of it. A society that gets much crazier than that probably won't be able to function.
Yeah, and the third thing, we have cohesion, coherence, and then the third thing I noticed was legitimacy. And if our institutions aren't making good decisions that we trust, providing results, providing the prosperity and everything else that we expect from them, they lose legitimacy. And we've seen that in the government, we've seen that in the media, we've seen that in the academia. All of them have lost legitimacy, and that's going to make it very hard for society to function, for our culture to function.
Yeah, again, talking about things just recently happened. The bald-faced lying by the Democrats about Joe Biden being a suitable person to be president for 4 more years. Even people I know that are center left and will end up voting for Kamala Harris were talking about voting for Trump because of the fact that they'd been gaslighted by the Democrats. I mean, they just were blatantly lying for months. And how in the world does that instill confidence in our institutions? It doesn't.
Yeah. In fact, the last one to relent on that lie was Kamala, right? She was like right up to the last lie. She lied to everyone right up to the last moment.
One of the things that set my wife over the high side was Kamala's commentary right after the debate. She's going, is she insane or is she lying? Right? Those are your only 2 possibilities, right? After having watched that debate with our own eyes.
Yeah. So my thinking is that we see all these individual problems that are cropping up, and we're getting a lot of those, but we have this deep damage. And if this deep damage doesn't occur overnight, there isn't any single factor, single event that we could point to that says, okay, here, this causes, or single person. Like, it's not all Trump, it's not all Biden, it's not all Obama, it's not all Bush.
It's not even Jim Rudd and John Robb, unfortunately.
Right. It has to be something bigger, because I look at a lot of problems, a lot of strategy from the decision-making angle. You use Boyd's Udal Loop and other things to analyze what went wrong. And from my perspective, it was a series of very bad decisions that...
Before you actually get to the punchline, I want you to take a minute to talk about Boyd's Udal Loop.
Okay. John Boyd, I consider him America's best strategist, he has a simplified decision-making model that I find very useful. He looked at most conflicts as a conflict of minds. That was his approach to strategy and warfare in general. His decision-making model is called the OODA: observe, orient, decide, act. 4 steps. Very simple. You observe the environment, you orient yourself, you make sense of that information, and you determine where you're going and what your goal is. And then you decide. It's basically the logistics, the thinking and the planning and the models that you're using to decide between various smaller choices. And then you act. You execute on that plan that you developed. And that the feedback from your actions is the new observation, right? And that if you're competing minds in warfare, it's the OODA loop that's better and faster that wins. And that if you go really fast while maintaining quality, you get inside the opponent's decision-making and they're dead before they know they're dead. It's like the dinosaur problem. By the time they find out that their legs are gone, and their brain finds out that their legs are gone, Yeah.
And of course, I've used the OODA loop as an analogy, at least, on how little lean startups can defeat multi-billion-dollar companies. Their OODA loops are just so much faster. You watch the message go from the sales force to the CEO and back to some action in the product group. It might take 6 months, while at a startup, it might take 6 hours. And
it's a lot of focus is on, and Boyd is partly to blame for this is that focus on the speed. But I think the quality is actually more important. The most important step in improving the quality of your decision-making is that orientation phase. And orientation says it is your sense-making. How do you make sense of the observations? And then determining where you want to go as a goal. Those are really the two major axes on it. And that process requires all of your training and education, all your cultural experience, your upbringing, everything comes into that, and it informs it and it constrains it. And that if you get your orientation right, everything's quite easy. If you get it wrong, it's like picking a wrong destination on a map when you're trying to get across a forest. You pick it going through the swamp and everything else. And even if you speed it up, you're still going in the wrong direction, right? You're making decisions faster in the wrong direction. The key is to get your orientation right, get focused on the right goal, make sense of the information in the right way. The more progress you make on that path, the better your decision making and easier your decision making is in the future. So it has this accelerating or kind of accruing returns as you move along that correct path.
Yeah, it's also an interesting thing when I try to explain the Udal Loop to people. It's the one people have the hardest time understanding. Observe, decide, and act are pretty straightforward, but orient, which I 100% agree with you, orient is the real secret sauce. Most organizations are okay at acting. Some are okay at deciding. Many are okay at observing, but orient is the hard one.
Yeah, I mean, that's why like CEOs, the least successful ones in the big companies always say they're focused on culture. That's all they could do. And that culture is a big piece of, that corporate culture is a big piece of orientation. In our personal lives, orientation or reorientation, going from one environment to another, here's a good example of that, is that say you're a successful executive, you're working 60-hour days, you've been successful in terms of your position and status and ability to make money, and then you retire. You turn it off. And then you have to reorient to this new environment, right? And people have a big problem reorienting and coming up with that new path, a new goal. There's heart attack spike in that first year. People just can't seem to be able to make that transition well. But orientation, if you get it right, you can be successful in that new space.
Interesting. I actually made that transition totally successfully. Laid down my sword in 2001, my business sword, at the top, one of the more successful mid-sized tech company CEOs, and for that, senior executive at major corporations, all the usual happy horse shit. But I was so fucking bored with it. I mean, I had no desire to do that ever again. But I also knew I'd retired, quote unquote, twice previously, once for 2 days and once for 2 months. Both times got sucked back into the Borg. And so I actually spent a few months before I knew when I wanted to retire to make sure that I had something that could reorient my life, my intellectual life and my execution life with sufficient power to, it's funny, in retrospect, I think back, I undergoaled the thing, but my goal was to find something to keep my attention for 2 years, right? So 2 days, 2 months, 2 years, kind of a brainless progression. And I came up with understanding complexity, particularly the joining of evolutionary theory and decision-making. And by making that decision, a whole series of weird things happened. I ended up at the Santa Fe Institute, not initially, but soon, and met all kinds of people. And it was totally changed why I got up in the morning, completely. And I never turned my head back, not once. So there's an interesting example.
Yeah, exactly. It's an amazing example. Reorienting on big ideas and thinking through big ideas and kind of tackling them.
Yeah, I was quoted in the New York Times as describing the life of a CEO as a mile wide and an inch deep. And I was ready to turn that around and go an inch wide and a mile deep. That was a lot of fun. So anyway, we've talked about John Boyd's famous OODA loop, focused on orientation. So now we're up to the punchline. And this is why I said at the outset, even though I'm generally skeptical of single cause stories, this was a little more persuasive than most. What's the single cause?
An orientation failure. Or more specifically, a reorientation failure. So the only thing that could cause damage at the level that we're seeing today, in the cohesion, coherence, and legitimacy, among other things, is a series of very bad decisions, each decision doing more and more damage, accumulated damage. And typically when that happens, it's usually due to an orientation failure. That people are, even if they execute perfectly, they're going in the wrong direction. And the losses accumulate, and the defections accumulate, and the damage accumulates to the point where they eventually fail. And I look back and I found that the big reorientation that we had was at the end of the Cold War. We came off the Cold War, but purportedly won it. We survived it, right? And that the orientation we used for making decisions during that process, fighting the Cold War, was the correct one. The containment process, the strategy that Kennan, kicked into motion of not trying to roll back Russia and China, but to contain their aggression and focus on success, economic success, and success of our society. That worked. And then we got to the end of the Cold War, and there weren't any foes in the world. We had Russia as a fledgling democracy. China was still a communist country, but relatively backward. And we had no pressing kind of threat environment that would force us to adopt a specific type of orientation. So we had to make it up. And what we ended up doing is that instead of reverting back towards becoming a normal country, a nation, and America's kind of historical role as a nation that led by example, by our economic and social progress and technological advances and the like, that didn't focus on war and the rest of the world, but focused most on improving ourselves, is that we made the choice to orient on globalism. So we had nationalism and globalism, and we chose the global path.
Let's make this clearer for the audience, that we were in a global strategy prior, right? The Cold War was a global strategy, and even World War II was a global strategy. And you make the point in the essay, it's harder to change an existing orientation like that has all this longevity. And we're talking about pre-game show. All kinds of vested interests get built up, right? The military-industrial complex, the political lobbyist industry, all these things that provide viscosity to the system make it difficult to change.
The Cold War strategy was actually more than that. I mean, even you go back to the early Kennan essay, is that, you adopt a global strategy in terms of the military power and foreign policy, but you also had to have a domestic policy to protect you against encroachment from socialist kind of messaging. And so you didn't end up with insurgencies and unrest that unraveled you. And so you had to actually have prosperity domestically. And so you had this cohesion was really important in order to to survive the Cold War. After the Cold War, we only stuck with the globalist side. And we gave up that whole need for cohesion and need for social progress, need for economic prosperity, focusing on citizens and improving their lives, making it possible for them to pursue happiness in the best way possible. And we didn't think we needed it. And doubling down on the globalist stuff and kind of giving up on the domestic stuff set us on a path that yielded all these bad decisions. And it wasn't like one day everything was adopted that way, but it was one thing after another. It was making a little decision in the mid-90s to, expand NATO. To do what? Contain Russia. But Russia's a fledgling democracy. Why are we doing that? Well, to keep it going.
Well, we did offer Russia the opportunity to join NATO.
No, they asked to join NATO and we said no. It was exactly the opposite.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
This always struck me that would have been the obvious. Well, I'm pretty sure I heard that somebody offered them the opportunity, but if not, it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, no. They asked to join NATO and we said no, because it was ostensibly there to contain Russia, because we never thought that would be a true friend. And it kept the arms business going, the whole military-industrial thing. And then we did it again in 2000, when we decided that we were going to take a communist country, a dictatorship, and convert it using capitalism by bringing China into WTO and opening our trade system to them. Again, little bit by little bit, and the kind of accumulated thinking and just, social, orientation on this yielded less and less focus on domestic prosperity and more focus on global issues and global micromanagement. And that had grown and grown over time and done more and more damage to our society, as that it proved over time that we've actually ended up in the wrong place, that the beliefs we had or the kind of orientation we have is not solving the problems that we're confronted with. And its attempts to do so is causing more and more damage. If you think about it, what kind of logical, rational process got the Biden administration to, go towards an open border? De facto, it's an open border right now. I mean, what rational process got us to that point? The only thing you can think of is that, hey, we have a global orientation and borders, and if we're focused on global citizens versus American citizens in the nationalist orientation, is that borders are not really necessary.
Well, I go further. The Wall Street Journal and the rich boy crowd has always been for open borders. Why is that? Cheap labor. So we have a stick to beat American labor with. You want $1 an hour more, hell with you. I'll just hire some Guatemalans, right? And people don't realize that traditionally the country club, CEO, business roundtable right has actually been the ones most in favor of open borders. And Biden is, of course, both kind of a bit on the left, but he's also always been in the pockets of the big banks.
Oh, definitely. It's a kind of mix of those who wanted cheap labor and those who don't see a difference between an American citizen and a global citizen. Everyone's a global citizen, and they deserve the right to travel across any territory.
And there's even a third class, I think is the most pernicious of all, which is ones who hate America, hate our own culture, and want to dilute it or destroy it. And they see this as one path to do that.
Yeah, well, part of deciding on a global path is that you have to minimize nationalism. And nationalism has increasingly become kind of a dirty word. I mean, you could even see it like the way we focus on democracy now, the process of democracy, not on the good of America or American democracy. It's just democracy. We've denigrated or minimized American history, called it problematic and fraught with problems, and that it didn't have any meaningful trajectory. It was attacking kind of the tribal narrative that kind of gives us the cohesion that we used to experience, used to enjoy, is that the cohesion that we have or used to have as American citizens is that it was built on this tribal narrative, is that where we came from, what we did together, where we're going, why this all is good, and that it's ennobling and it's enriching, and that you can trust other people that accept that story. When you destroy that kind of cohesion layer, that fictive kinship evaporates, and you get rid of that American citizen cohesion, and you end up with different identity groups becoming more important. Which faction are you part of? Which ethnicity, which religion, which whatever, that becomes more important than whether or not they're American or not.
Yeah, and in fact, when you come up with this racist neo-tribalism, one of the ways they've pushed it forward is to, attack the American credo so that, this group was, in some way disadvantaged by some historical event. Of course, almost every group's been disadvantaged by some historical event. But when you make that the focus of this woke neo-racist tribalism, you essentially have everybody attacking the narrative. And of course, the narrative breaks. I would say that's the third rationale for open borders, is to get more little tribes so the tribes can play neo-racism and attack the American credo.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Well, let's go back and do a little history here. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Think about 1992. Cold War has been won. The guy that came second in the Republican primaries was Pat Buchanan. And he was absolutely about reorienting our politics to the national and away from the global. And as you predicted, they just dumped all kinds of shit on his head.
I mean, he was called all sorts of names, and he was basically squeezed out. He really wasn't that extreme. I mean, if you really look at his stuff, I mean, it was just, it was something that people would have been comfortable with back in the early 80s, for the most part.
He just had a very inflammatory style. And he also just was having so much fun. I got to chat with him one time, and I think the thing that came through was that he just loved the game, and he loved selling his ideas, and he knew he was a little over the top, which was kind of a shame. But then, around the same time, Clinton comes out, which is a new kind of Democrat bought and paid for by the money power, who's going to do NAFTA, et cetera, and Bush as well, classic white shoe banker family back generations, et cetera. And then we get this guy, Ross Perot, who comes out, and he also is trying to refocus back on a national focus. At least I'd say that's one way to think about it. What do you make of that as another thing that's happening around the same time?
Oh, yeah, that Ross Perot thing. Ross was that, he probably would have become president if he had run. He completed his campaign, but they took him out hardcore.
I don't know. I think he took himself out. Unfortunately, I think he was nuts Because remember, he quit because they were insulting his daughter's wedding or something. But then he came back and he still got 19% of the vote. But at the time that he pulled out, he had like 35% of the vote. He could easily have won. But did he go nuts? Well, I'd love to know the real story of that somehow.
Yeah, I think there were some threats made. Hey, who knows? If he hasn't disclosed, he hasn't disclosed.
Well, he's dead now, so unless we find some written record. Now, the next thing, we go back in the historical record, is, I would argue, a kind of unstrategic response to 9/11, right? We certainly needed to do something, and we did a very clever thing, which was using mostly special forces, put the Northern Alliance to overthrow the Taliban. And I said we could have gone there maybe for 9 months to back them up. And then when we leave, we should have left after 9 months, nailed a sign to the door of their legislature, say, we don't give a fuck what you do in your own country, but if any of your fucking terrorists come back to the United States, we're going to blow your shit up again. And then give the Northern Alliance guys $2 billion a year in cash delivered in pallets once every 3 months, and said, have a nice day. But nope, we couldn't resist trying to turn a medieval theocracy into Sweden. And what a stupid-ass idea that was. And then we compounded it with an even more insane thing, which was to get into this fight with Iraq, who was more or less on our side against the Islamicists. And then another 10 years shit show. So how about that as a demonstration pivot point in history?
Yeah, I mean, going towards a national orientation of U.S. national security, we'd have focused on, cutting the budget, taking advantage of the opportunity to save a ton of money. And that in 9/11, if it did happen, a U.S. focused on its actual core security, would have been responded to with special ops and special programs and law enforcement deals across the world. That would have been it. It'd been over. But what ended up happening is that because we had this global orientation, we still were thinking in terms of micromanaging the world security system, maintaining a global presence, maintaining high levels of defense spending. It immediately became an embarrassment that we were leveraged into an opportunity to buy the worst elements, like the neocons. Those guys were quacks, insane, hijacked by groups of people who were focused on micromanaging the global security situation, and doing so in such a ham-fisted way that it ended up costing us tons of money and doing more damage to the global security system than it was in place before they started. I mean, like toppling Libya. I mean, granted, Gaddafi was a pain in the ass, but now it's like a haven for the Libyans and for Europe now, because it's a conduit for migrant flows. There's slavery going on now and things like that. And then toppling Syria by backing ISIS and having ISIS blow up after the conflict was lost. And Iraq, of course, and Afghanistan, and nation building and toppling regimes, spending $2.5 trillion on Afghanistan, on this crazy idea that we were building like you said, a Sweden in Asia, is that, and then to not recognize that we're actually doing the wrong thing because of this globalist orientation, is that it prevented us from actually fixing the problem. You could even see the national security, consequences of continuing to expand NATO. And then we got to the point where we made a big push a year before the Ukraine invasion to get Ukraine into NATO, to punish Russia, punish Putin for interfering in our elections. It was like, and that blew up. And if you look at it, it was a kind of inevitable process. I mean, Kennan wrote about this back in the 90s. He said this will eventually, in 20 years or so, turn Russia into an enemy. And what kind of rational process would get us into a Cold War again? 30 years after we won it. I mean, how, and potentially not only with Russia, but also with China, because we're on this process of creating a full-on Cold War with China too. Again, this globalist orientation, not focusing on trade and economic success and technological success, and focusing on treating every single other nation as a potential trading partner that we will trade fairly with, mutually beneficial arrangements, so we could both improve, playing weird political games for micromanaging, perspectives and alignment.
Let's turn briefly to where we ended up after all this with respect to global economics. You have a nice little section on that. Where did this actually bring us after, this was supposed to have been the great end of Cold War windfall? And I will say Clinton did cut the defense budget spectacularly there for a while. But old George W. couldn't help himself. He ramped it back up and further than it had been before. Then, as you said, the opening to China was really dumb and naive. Where's that left us from a global economic perspective with the United States today?
Well, we let China ravage our manufacturing sector, and now we are heavily dependent on China for almost all our manufactured goods. And that if you walk down, Walmart or Costco or whatever, you look at the goods that are all, coming from China, and that we have a massive deficit. It's in the 35 trillion at this point, I think is the latest figure, and it's headed north of that. We'll end up with 50% of the revenue that we take in just used to pay interest, and that's unsustainable. And that if we do end up in a Cold War with Russia and China, and we have two separate trading systems, we'll probably lose, because China's the number one trading partner of almost all countries in the world. Most of Europe knows that they're also dependent upon them, and that they're unlikely to join us in any kind of embargo of China. Did I miss anything out of that thing, description of the economic problem?
Yeah, the one thing you had in your economic section was that we are now become extremely dependent on using sanctions to enforce our will, or attempt to enforce our will, usually unsuccessfully.
Yeah, part of that whole global micromanagement kind of thinking in this orientation has led us to using inclusion in our system as a weapon of war. And so we're out sanctioning everybody. And that's why, if China, that kind of thinking will get us immediately into trouble with China if they take Taiwan. Because we immediately opt to do, kind of a full-on embargo, 100% embargo. And we'll get like Japan and a couple other countries to join us, but we'd be by ourselves, disconnected.
Though, fortunately, China is in a really shit-bad strategic position, right? All their commerce goes by sea, and our attack subs could shut them down entirely at no risk to us.
I don't think direct military confrontation with China, direct military confrontation with Russia is in the cards, because they have really ramped up their nuclear capacity, and that U.S. troops firing on Chinese nationals wouldn't play. There is kind of a weird gray zone now we have with drones. There's a tendency to think that, if drone does it, it doesn't really count. It's that we have Ukrainian drones now hitting strategic early warning systems in Russia, and somehow that doesn't count as a provocation that could cause a nuclear war. And that there's, a U.S. Navy admiral threatening to send drones into the Taiwan Straits and undersea drones to stop the invasion, or at least give them a black eye. That could potentially get us into problem areas. No, I think a direct confrontation isn't likely. What's more likely is proxies. If we do end up in two different trading systems, the U.S. trading system and the Chinese trading system, is that, and where we can't attack each other directly, is that China will ship drones like they did, like the Houthis. Houthis are providing an excellent model for this, is that with even a small amount of drones, they're able to shut down trade going through the Red Sea, that section of the Indian Ocean. And the U.S., from all accounts, is a parking lot now. There's nothing going through. They've been able to effectively shut it down, and even though with the U.S. Navy fighting, one of its most intense engagements since World War II, it's not been able to reverse it or slow it down. Even U.S. naval ships are under attack almost every day now. And imagine China doing that with Venezuela and Cuba and all sorts of countries all around the world. And each of those countries selectively applying trade embargoes to the areas next to their territory, for air, land, and sea.
Yeah, of course, they are more vulnerable even than we are, though, because, again, we can cut off. It's like we do it with drones. We get the Philippines to do it with drones, right? They are really fucked. All their oil comes through the states of Malacca, 75% of their oil. I don't know if they want to start that game, because we have a whole series of nice counters there.
Yeah, I know. In terms of proxies, I think they might be better off than we are. But in terms of drones, they produce 95% of all drones. We'd have problems producing, 100, at least military level, 150, 200,000 in the first year. I mean, they're going to be producing tens of millions.
I don't know about that. I just had a guy from Ukraine on my show whose company makes the leading cluster control software for clusters of drones so that one operator can fly up to 100 drones. And he says that other sources I've checked on that Ukraine will probably make 600,000 drones this year, make them themselves. And if little shit-ass Ukraine can make 600,000 drones in a year, how many drones can big-ass United States make? You're probably 5 million easily.
Yeah, those are the little tactical drones.
Yeah, they're a mix of all kinds of things. But, the Taiwan Strait's only 100 miles wide, so these things don't have to be very long range. Sea drones are real cheap, particularly ones go just below the surface, very hard to stop. I think what we've done here, I've talked about this with Samo Boria, is we may have well reached a time in history like World War I, and where the strategic defensive has way more power than the strategic offensive. And so we may see nobody able to do anything, basically.
Potentially, it does appear to be that defense is more.
Russians aren't making much progress on the ground despite outnumbering Ukraine, about 6-1. And, I think the Chinese would be very foolish to try, if they don't do it in the next 2 years, they'd be very foolish to try a cross-straits invasion of Taiwan, because by that point, Taiwan will have turned itself into a hedgehog. And
right.
I don't care how many ships.
Exactly.
Just as happened in the U.S. Civil War, where the mini ball changed the dynamics from the Napoleonic era. Smart missiles, asymmetric exchange ratios. I use a $200,000 rocket to sink your $1 billion cruiser. All point to a big swing towards defense having an advantage, and that's probably good.
Yeah. So there's a timer on Taiwan, so it's 2 to 3 years before they have enough drones to defend themselves. Yet we decided to make it a strategic imperative for China to invade Taiwan by going through with this chip ban, basically saying you can't have all the NVIDIA graphics chips you need for AI development because we're not going to let you. And if they want those chips, they have to take Taiwan Semiconductor. And it's basically saying that all their AI programs and a lot of their high-end development is going to be put on hold until they match that in 5 to 10 years. So, so if they want to compete technologically in the high end, they're going to have to take Taiwan.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, no, we could, but the global orientation is like forcing us in this direction towards this confrontation, and we're not thinking through what it means. Say China does take Taiwan. What does this environment look like when we don't have access to high-end chips anymore? It's just gone. We have to invent everything from scratch again. I mean, that's going to take a while, and we'd fall way, way behind. It's just it's a failure of imagination on a big scale. It's like exactly what happened with Russia and expanding NATO. It's like you could see how Russia was responding defensively to all these encroachments. But again, this global orientation is getting us into a lot of problems across all the areas, and it's dug deep into things that kept us stable.
Let's dig in a little bit to this China thing. What would a national strategy look like with respect to China and Taiwan?
A national strategy would have meant that we weren't dependent on Taiwan to begin with. Okay, we would have forced them early on to start moving more of their factories to the United States, right? Or at least balance it out. So as many chips that are produced inside Taiwan that came to the United States, they would be producing here. Remember what happened to Japan when they were killing our auto industry in the 90s? And Baker went to Japan and said, hey, here's your cap. You can sell this many cars, okay? Or, this amount of product. Or you can buy more of ours to kind of offset that, but that's as much of a deficit you're going to be able to run. So figure it out. And the car industry revived itself and was able to, it was going out of business. It was getting crushed. And we have a car industry in the States as a result of that. Well, in the early aughts, we got dragged in by the neocons and others into the Middle East, which is a strategic non-entity now for us, or U.S. national security. And we totally neglected this whole China trade thing. We neglected all of the national implications that, letting them take away so much manufacturing capacity and letting Taiwan and South Korea and Japan take away so much of our hard work capacity. what would have been the national policies? That we wouldn't have been dependent. So, if they took Taiwan, it wouldn't have been, we could have said, oh, that's terrible, you shouldn't have done that. Maybe be more wary of them in the future and less likely to do trade with them due to the expansionary policy, but we wouldn't go into a full-scale world war in an inferior position.
Let's take through our chain of argument, which is the root cause of a lot of our problems is a incorrect orientation in the John Boyd observe, orient, decide, act cycle. And that error of orientation is, according to John Robb, a globalist orientation rather than a nationalist orientation, which we flipped to more fully at the end of the Cold War. What are the prospects for flipping back to a national orientation? And is that even possible at this point?
I don't think there's a rational process that will get us there. The political challengers that have a nationalist orientation are constantly weeded out. All the discussions are still within the context of a globalist orientation. What will probably happen is that we fail hard. We fall into that kind of war with China and that kind of scenario where we become economically destitute. And a lot of people assume that we'd actually fight it. That we would rally to fight it. We have zero cohesion. It's very possible that there would be a huge group of people that would say, this war is stupid, we shouldn't be fighting this, and refuse to participate or try to negotiate around the government that was trying to embargo. So that kind of collapse could cause a reconciliation, which would lead to more of a national focus, where we're focusing on cohesion, we're focusing on coherence, we're focusing on legitimacy of our institutions and delivering, this high quality prosperity and improvement in Americans' quality of life, making American citizenship worth something. And it's not like shutting off the borders with immigration, but coming up with a rational immigration process and getting back to that kind of rationality. There's nothing that will force you to reorient faster than defeat and getting your face shoved in the dirt. It's like getting punched in the face, that old Mike Tyson thing. It's like,
yep.
Have
all the plans you want until you get punched in the face, right?
You get punched in the face, you'll start figuring out what reality is and what isn't. Because right now we're living in fantasy land. The globalist dream that we've been headed towards, that goal is utopia, but it's a false utopia. It's not possible. It's not, it's requires a ton of sacrifice from Americans in their citizenship, their national story, their finances, their success. Everything has their identity. They had, the loss of identity that's been damaging Americans. All that has to be sacrificed for this utopia. Like most utopias, it's just illusory, and we got to get rid of that. We got to just dispense with it. You see any kind of process that will get us there? I just don't see any rational actors emerging in this environment to argue it.
Yeah, I don't see it in the short term. I mean, and as we talked about before the show, the continuing trend of reduced capacity for collective sense making makes it even less likely. So if there's going to be a turnaround, the first thing that has to be turned around is a society-wide improvement in our collective sense-making capacity, not what we currently seem to be in, which is further decline. So I would be looking for that as the precursor to perhaps getting to this flip. But looking at the inertia in the system today, you may well be right. It's just too hard of a lift. There's too many vested interests invested in the decline of collective sense-making in a globalist perspective, and it may be that we can't turn until we collapse. Maybe we'll find a way, but I don't see one.
Yeah, it's kind of depressing. I've always been kind of I had a lot of kind of arguments for doom in the future, but it was always hard to actually see a path where the U.S. actually did go through a hardcore collapse. I didn't think that, a new Cold War was possible. 4 years ago. I mean, how stupid can we be to stumble into a new Cold War? I mean, it defies my imagination that we'd come up with a rationale and that it would be popular to enter a new Cold War and expand that Cold War to a level where we potentially could lose it. It definitely is very depressing, and I hope we come to our senses. But you know what? There is some glimmer of light, is that if the protests against immigration going on in Vienna and Scotland and Ireland and the UK right now, pick up enough steam and become legitimate because of their size, has the potential to actually change things. But I suspect that they'll just be crushed and marginalized and jailed. Even though the strategy to get around being jailed is to increase the size of the protest to the point where they can't jail everybody, right? They can't add 2 or 3 million people to the jail system like Martin Luther King did. And there's more authoritarianism going on in the United States now because of this loss of control, this hollowness of governance that's going on. You know, just revelation is now that Tulsi Gabbard is put on a terrorist watch list now and being followed. They did a Scott Ritter the other day. The FBI raided his house. I mean, harsh critic of U.S. policy, but the guy is just a Twitter guy. You know, and here he is being a podcaster. And here he is being raided by the FBI. And what Robert Kennedy's complaining about how they were trying to censor him and trying to control, the government being used as a weapon against political opposition that doesn't agree with him. That bodes poorly for the future as well.
I want to thank John Robb for first his wonderful essay and then this great conversation to elucidate upon it.
Thanks, Joe.
Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.